And welcome to the first panel of the second day of this conference. I'm Olmo Calzolai, and I am delighted to be presenting Conglomerates number 4, I think. So thank you very much to Adele Bardazzi, Roberto Binetti, and Nicola Gardini for inviting me, even though I'm no Zanzotto expert, but I'm very excited to be here. In this panel, we're gonna discuss a cluster of sciences, both hard sciences and social sciences, and we're going to be talking about psychoanalysis, psychology, and ecology. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers today, and the first one is our very own Roberto Binetti, who is completing a doctorate at Oxford in Italian and is graduate development scholar and tutor in Italian St. Anne's College. His PhD thesis, Voices from a Minor Literature, focuses on Italian women's poetry in the 70s and reassesses this literary phenomenon in the light of stylistic originality and relationship with contemporary history. He is interested in contemporary poetry, literary theory, psychoanalysis, cultural history, and eco-criticism. And he's also the co-founder and coordinator of Italian Poetry Today. Today, Roberto will be talking about Seasons of Silence, Landscapes of Aphasia in Haiku for a Season.
Thank you very much, Olmo, for the generous introduction. I'm gonna try to share my screen now somehow. Here we are. Should be visible on your screen, right? Yes, perfect. Today, I'm gonna present a paper focus on Haiku for a Season. This collection has been named a few times during the last 2 days of conference. I will be trying also to connect to what Stefano was saying before, especially regarding some of symbolism that interests all in Zanzotto's production, but through my paper will emerge, especially the poppy symbolism, the symbolism related to colors, and especially the red color in Haiku for a Season. Andrea Zanzotto's poetic and intellectual oeuvre is firmly grafted around 2 main polarities: the subject, the lyric subject on the one hand, and language. If on the one hand, the subject is placed in Zanzotto's poetry as the constitutive center of poetic and human experience, on the other hand, language, the poetic language, represents the fundamental nucleus of his unrepeatable verbal experience. Not only is language fundamental for the purposes of completing the experience of the world, but it should be considered, in termini lacaniani, as constitutive of the world itself. Objects, like events, not only would be not representable without language, otherwise they would lose any ontological foundation, any linguistic foundation. They would not exist. An object exists precisely as it can be named. Within the lyric code and Zanzotto's poetry, the verbal experience of the subjects is, in this context, a totalizing experience that can be transported from a segmented and strict individual dimension to a dimension in which the other, the great other, in Lacanian terms, can recognize himself in the function of an hypothetical reader. And that Zanzotto's poetic production is situated within this dynamic of excavation within the potential and limits of poetic language, which is then brought into collision with the verbal experience of all different subjects, not just the lyric subject of poetry. In this sense, the excavation is carried out by Zanzotto within what can be defined as the limits of authenticity and inauthenticity of poetic language. In particular, this reflection becomes crucial in the period of time that includes the publication of La Beltà in 1968, but also until Il Galateo in Bosco, 1979. And that Zanzotto's entire production can therefore, but especially in the 70s, be inscribed within this pathway by the 2 extremes coinciding with the parola piena on the one hand, the encounter with alterity, the other, the great other, and its desire, And on the other hand, the parola vuota, the experience limited by a narcissistic experience of reality, the small other to a certain extent, always in Lacanian terms. Zanzotto's exploration seeks to reactivate language that is truly authentic. This kind of movement leads the poet to confront the dimension of silence, of the cancellation of every possibility of the poetic word. As Zanzotto states in a poem included in the collection published in 1983, we can read this authentic approach to silence in lyric poetry. I quote from Fosfeni: ben disposti silenzi, indisseppellibili, ma pur sparsi in scintillamento nudo, o in nebbiosco alle cieche ordinati, silenzi sempre innovati e pur sempre in fedeltà protrusi, entro innumerabili estrazioni di tempo, silenzi sottratti ad ogni speculazione. I would like to ask you to remember this expression, nebbiosco alle cieche, that will re-emerge, this like mist, the fog, also in Haiku for a Season, which will be the collection published, at least written after, not published, written after Fosfeni. If authenticity cannot be sought in the institutionalized and highly formalized language of lyric poetry, then the poet's main attempt must be to find another way, a different kind of language. This can be seen above all in the poetic collection published in the long 70s, by means of a series of linguistic institutions used by Zanzotto in order to force the limits of the poetic words. These are, for example, the Petel or Lingua Latta in La Beltà, the journalistic language in Gli Sguardi Fatti Segnal, but also the Venetic in Filò, the Babelism and the use of different languages in Pasque, but also the graphic science in Galateri in Bosco. In an essay entitled Qualcosa al di fuori e al di là dello scrivere, published in April 1979, the poet openly expresses views on the finalità terapeutiche della poesia, taking up on the figure of the Freudian and Lacanian neurotic. Poetry is at the same time the origin of the trauma di cui si ignora la natura and a therapeutic path within language. Language, as we have previously pointed out, is a constitutive of the very experience of the world through the subjective filter. The therapeutical path tends to coincide with a relationship between the poet and a language that can be reactivated through its own plurilingualism, which Zanzotto himself defines un contratto sociale fra conscio e inconscio alla base di ogni linguaggio. This is not given as a linear path through the languages used in poetry, but it always stems from a state of alarm and from the liability of this condition. According to Agosti, the approach to the nucleus of human language, the language of the infants, the Petel, that I was mentioning before with reference to La Beltà, presupposes a slow precipitation of the poet into this abyss of aphasia, the impossibility of expressing something through the lyric language. Aphasia becomes a fundamental and risky presupposition of this deconstruction and stands as a sort of regression of language with respect to memory and to the hierarchical memorization of cultural sediments. As we said, the Petel, but also the language of journalism, the symbols in Galateri in Bosco, so a different kind of attempts to encompass the silence in the 70s. And I quote from Eterna riabilitazione di un trauma di cui si ignora la natura, another passage that I find particularly interesting on this topic. Il deserto della poesia è parlare per qualcuno che nonostante parli, a un certo momento si trova sepolto in silenzio, una sabbia mobile che invece è asciutta come certi posti dell'Asia centrale. C'è la percezione del fatto che oggi non si può dire solo una voce che parla nel deserto. Non è una vox clamans in deserto, è la sabbia che lo soffoca. However, there is a season in Zanzotto's literary and personal life in which this reflection on silence, the reflection on silence that he developed in the 70s, is no longer confined to the aesthetic field, but becomes a veritable esperienza verbale, So that relationship that we were mentioning before between the lyric subject and language, forming the experience of reality. This coincides with the period following the publication of the collection Fosfeni within Mondadori's Lo Specchio series in 1983. This was one of the darkest periods of Andrea Zanzotto's life, perceived by the author himself as a phase of entry into the old age. He began to suffer from insomnia between January and March 1984, a condition that forced him to hospitalization. During these months, he began to keep a personal diary, which was later reread as an attempt to distance himself from poetry writing. I quote again from Eterna riabilitazione di un trauma: ma la poesia non riusciva più a guarirmi davvero. Più tardi mi sono interessato di scienze, neuroscienze, e su quelle tiro avanti aspettando novità. The period between April and June coincides with the bleakest month of depression. It is precisely in this emergent season in which silence is no longer an aesthetic instrument for the investigation of language, but turns into a debilitating pathology that Zanzotto begins to write the short compositions that will flow into the collection Haiku for a Season. So this is the occasion that produced this collection of short texts written in English. The collection is formed by short fragments in English developed according by a multi-strophic structure, which according to the author's wishes is derived from a free interpretation of the haikus form of Japanese poetry. In this sense, the operation carried out by Zanzotto is unique, not only within his own corpus, but also within the Italian literary canon. Although he had often resorted to different languages, dialects, and other signifiers, as we said in the 70s precisely, Zanzotto had never written an entire work in another language, if we don't consider, for example, Philò and the use of Binetti language. And above all, he had never written any poems in English. In this way, a further level is created within the dynamics of authorial plurilingualism. According to Furio Brugnolo's definition, poetic plurilingualism is that particular procedure consisting in the use of two or more different idioms in a predetermined succession of or alternation within the same poetic text as a formal unit. We cannot speak of plurilingualism in this case, and in particular related to Haiku for a Season, because we have the translations of the poems by Zanzotto, but originally the whole collection is written in English. If previously dialect and its refined form of petel had functioned as a fertile instrument for the purpose of reactivating poetic Italian, at this moment in Zanzotto's life, this mechanism no longer seems to function in a therapeutical way. In this sense, the movement carried out by Zanzotto is no longer simply limited within the dynamics of multilingualism. English is first and foremost another language, as we were told, and it was highlighted yesterday in the keynote lecture by John Welly. English is an untranslatable language with no affective link with the author. It is indeed part of that parola vuota that we have been trying to define and that Zanzotto is trying to reactivate also through this process. The linguistic experience carried out in Haiku for a Season is therefore a new and totalizing experience, a pathway towards the parola piena. Sorry. The research on the phenomenon of code switching, which is going to be the term I'm going to use to analyze Haiku for a Season, trying to move away from the definition of plurilingualism in the 70s. The research on the phenomenon of code switching, which has further investigated the functions, modalities, and structure of multilingual speech utterances, will therefore prove to be fundamental for the analysis of Haiku for a Season. The definitions and categories identified by this field of context linguistics are in fact also applicable to the examination of Haiku for a Season. In particular, I'm going to analyze to what extent and to what codes we can verify a sort of switch, a movement between different codes. Code switching goes beyond the dynamics of Zanzotto's precedent plurilingualism. In Haiku for a Season, for example, it is not only the choice of English as the literary language that produces a shift within the code. But it is possible to recognize two other elements that contribute to this dynamic. Code switching also takes place in the field of metaphors used by Zanzotto, but also in the use of a different and diverse poetic form, the haiku, the Japanese form. So I will focus mainly on the second mode of code switching, that is the one that concerns the creation of a new vocabulary and metaphors in this new code of poetry that Zanzotto is creating in Haiku for a Season. In doing so, I will make use of what Brian Boyd had said about the dynamics of pattern recognition in lyric poetry. I briefly read the quote on the slide. The world swarms with information which humans, animals, or even plants can interpret in order to respond appropriately to threats and opportunities in their environment. But analyzing this information is costly in time and effort. Brain, therefore, operates not by logic, but rather by pattern recognition. So what I'm gonna do with Haiku for a Season is trying to identify these patterns in the collection. Haiku for a Season, according to Zanzotto, is a collection that doesn't have an internal structure, but we can reconstitute this narratological pattern through the use and through the analysis of certain metaphors within the collection. Metaphor functions in this sense a new pattern capable of providing a new signifier to overcome the impasse of silence. Moreover, Zanzotto's haikus abolish any kind of internal narrative development, building instead a new narratological structure of the book. The center is the alternation of months, seasons, and atmospheric phenomena throughout the book, which provide a framework for narrating the tale of silence. I'm going to analyze in particular actually two patterns relating to colors and to the alternation of different months in Haiku for a Season, and then a second kind of pattern relating to flowers, for example, and to weather. The months of illness are arranged within the book, creating a macro pattern that is both narratological and metaphorical, faced with the absence of events, except from the imperceptible alternation of atmospherical phenomena. So the seasons on the one hand, the colors, but also the flowers. An important element in the structure of these dynamics is undoubtedly the use of colors, which are carefully arranged by the author to render the different emotional tones of this crossing of this aphasic experience. We have a sort of different representation of colors from pink towards red within the development of the collection. In particular, I was inspired by a work by Wordsworth, Vasseur, and Dumley on the evolution of the vocabulary in Sylvia Plath's Ariel, in which these two authors try to do the same as I'm trying to do with Zanzotto, analyzing the patterns in Ariel. In particular, I try to order the different text from Haiku for a Season, highlighting on the one hand, the alternation of different months, and on the other hand, the use of different colors, especially in the deepest and darkest period of these aphasic crisis experiment lived by Zanzotto. So we start from pink and violet rose. In April, pink arise when it's sunset, it's sink, but also we have the term, these new sort of paranomasia, aprilities, referring again to the month, and then the alternation between violet and rose in the fourth haiku. We still have roses alternated with blue, green, and violet in May. So no more May, they say in blue and gray, secret insects, secret ales. But also the introduction of the new color violet, and again, black and blue. The alternation between these darker colors. In June, we get back to red, which we learned from Stefano Dal Bianco's lecture, is a very important symbol within Zanzotto's poetry, in particular related to the representation of poetry itself, to that kind of symbolism. So there is a positive undertones in this re-emergence of like red poppies and other flowers in this period between June and July. Lyric poetry is healing to a certain extent, and this is highlighted also by the use of different colors and the alternation between red and light blue in these last haikus. And then we have the very end of the, almost the very end of Haiku for a Season, in the month of July, Joy of July. Source of all joy is the shape of haiku, or maybe other poems. Sweetly, palely in nature's lips writing, with this idea of a sort of closure to this experience. The second pattern relates to the weather, in particular the representation in the first half of the haikus related to the months of April and June of these fog. So we have, for example, a series of references, again, using the color violet and rose again, but also this reference, this hammering reference to fog in this very first part of the Haiku for a Season. So we read, an interior word fog generates frogs, with the use of a further pun to highlight this weather condition, but also it becomes mist in another haiku from the same month, and then again wind and dust still flowering in absent-minded clouds. Then in the month of June, which coincides with a further moment of healing, a new stage in Zanzotto's composition of the haikus, but also in Zanzotto's collection, we find again a lot of red, but especially the also symbol of poppies, which is almost mentioned in each poem from these very period. So blessed instant daisies, blessed poppies, but also solitary red, the red billion banks, his friends and me poppies, poppies where small weak troops, and why and when, poppy absence smell, only when poppy wings, etc., etc., etc. There is this act of sort of blossoming within this particular time, and this time also within the composition of the haikus. Lastly, we have the last reference to poppies in July, again, one of the last poems from Haiku for a Season, where poppies played the sequel past 100 years ago. The combination of these patterns, obsessive metaphors that punctuate the temporality, the landscape to a certain extent of this silence in Haiku for a Season, ends up creating a dense web of references that allows the poet to overcome the obstacle of silence. What the poet defines as a new star system starts manifesting itself, a new code that has slowly constructed a different linguistic constellation. As we read, for example, in two of the most, I think, beautiful poems from Haiku for a Season, introduced by this reference to Shakespeare, King Lear, all is ripeness and more, water lies, skies, flower, bees, the simple eyes wishes to get into this new star system. And then again, other meadows, wishes, feelings in this new star system. The man who avoided, who threaded, comes riding his untiring bike. So we have this image of the eye, the lyric subject, the center, with language of this verbal experience that we try to analyze in Haiku for a Season, becomes the new center within this new star system, this operated and as a result of the code switching between Italian and English, but also between these different patterns that we try to highlight. I stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.